This is a subject that I've wanted to cover for quite some time. Let's talk about the 6th generation consoles. Here we have the Sega Dreamcast, the Sony PlayStation 2, the Nintendo GameCube, and finally the Microsoft Xbox. Today we're going to evaluate each system and compare them to find out which ones come out on top. As always, you can feel free to agree or disagree with the opinions present in this video, and I welcome you to make your own conclusions. So with that said, let's get started. The Sega Dreamcast was developed in response to the shortcomings of the Sega Saturn. It was promised to deliver more than the Saturn while being less expensive to manufacture. Being released on September 9, 1999 in the United States, it was definitely ahead of its time, and many developers took note, releasing ports of many of their 5th generation console games like Toy Story 2 Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue, Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness, and Rayman 2 The Great Escape to the Dreamcast, with a significant jump in graphics and performance. It was discontinued after some heavy competition with the other consoles in 2003. Despite the shorter lifespan, there were many notable games released for the system, many of which were ported over to the other consoles and thus received the recognition that they deserved. The system has a huge cult following, and very much like the Commodore 64, games are still being developed for it today. An example of this would be NG Dev Team's Gunlord, which is a 2D side-scroller in the style of the Turrican games, primarily Turrican 2 on Amiga and Super Turrican on Super Nintendo. The Sony PlayStation 2 was announced as a direct competitor to the Sega Dreamcast, and the system's success is one of the key things that led to the Dreamcast's decline. In fact, success is putting it lightly, as the system became the best-selling video game console in history, with over 155 million units sold. Despite being released as early as March of 2000, it was discontinued as late as January of 2013, with games being developed for it even up to that point. The Nintendo GameCube was released on November 18, 2001 in the United States, and was, to a large degree, a product of self-evaluation. There's a lot of talk about what Sony did right with the original PlayStation, and the mistakes that Nintendo made with the Nintendo 64. After their incredibly impressive work on Star Wars Rogue Squadron, game development studio Factor 5 helped design the GameCube, and otherwise provided their input to Nintendo during the system's development. After the decision of making the Nintendo 64 difficult to program for backfired, Nintendo made the GameCube much more developer-friendly. The system was advertised to be everything the Nintendo 64 wasn't, which is logical enough seeing how most of the development choices were made in response to the worst aspects of the Nintendo 64. However, it was overshadowed by the PS2 and Xbox, and while it sold better than the Dreamcast, it wasn't as successful as Nintendo hoped. Since then, like the Dreamcast, it has gained a reputation for being rather underrated, and today it appears to be one of the more talked about consoles from this generation. The Microsoft Xbox was the first American video game console to be made after the failure of the Atari Jaguar. It was developed in hopes that it would compete with the PlayStation 2, which was attracting more developers who were losing interest in making games for Windows, at least in the eyes of Microsoft. The name of the Xbox is derived from the system's DirectX technology, with the original name being the DirectX Box before it was shortened. It was designed more like a PC of the time than the other consoles, and even had a built-in hard drive, which made the system quite attractive. The system was quite expensive to make, so despite the high number of units sold, Microsoft lost money because of it. As a result, they took a different approach with the Xbox 360.
And we all know that the Xbox at the same time, the very first Xbox, not the one, but the one, that Microsoft lost a lot of money on it. Because, I mean, yes, it had these features, but they paid a hefty price for it. They paid a very hefty price for it, and they got much more clever with the 360, which was basically very much based around the design of the GameCube, actually, of all things. If you look at it hardware architecture-wise, the 360 is pretty much a GameCube, much larger.
I personally love the appearance of the Dreamcast. Its design is both aesthetically pleasing and very functional. It's very easy to transport and set up, with the AC and AV ports being very identifiable and easy to locate. The system has 4 controller ports, with 2 memory card slots per controller, allowing up to 8 memory cards being used at once. The controller itself, despite looking a bit odd, is actually very nice to use. It fits one's hands well, and all the buttons are very conveniently placed. The VMU, standing for Virtual Memory Unit, served as the memory card for the system, but it also served other functions as well. For example, while playing a game, the screen will display a picture or even a series of pictures relating to the game that you're currently playing. It also runs on 2 batteries, so some games will allow you to use the VMU independently for small mini-games, like with the Chows and the Sonic Adventure games. In the GameCube ports of these games, they did similar things using the Game Boy Advance connection cable. If the batteries run out, you won't be able to do this, but it will still function when hooked up with the controller. There were also other peripherals like microphones used in games like Seaman. Have fun with your nightmares tonight.
I beg to differ. You may not think I'm attractive, but your wife will. Grrr.
The system also has a modem for online capabilities that still have some functionality today. My only problem with the Dreamcast is the wretched noises that it makes. From the sustaining high-pitched beep coming from the VMU, to the sounds the system makes when scanning the disc.
Bullseye, what are you doing?
The PlayStation 2 has two models, the original more bulky model and the Slim. The Slim model is what many people prefer and is what I own. On the exterior of the console, you got a top-loading disc tray, a power reset button, an eject button for the disc tray, 2 controller ports, and 2 memory card slots. On the note of controller ports, the PlayStation 2 was the only 6th generation console to have 2 as opposed to 4. After the Dreamcast faded into the background, the PS2 became the least capable system available at the time. Despite that, more games were made for it, and it lasted far longer than any of its competitors. Another thing that made the PlayStation 2 attractive was the fact that it could be used as a DVD player without any attachments or modding. Just put in the disc and you're good to go. Whereas the Dreamcast couldn't play DVDs, the GameCube used mini DVDs for games, so a regular DVD wouldn't even fit in the disc tray.
Now that's just silly.
And the Xbox could play DVDs, but you needed an extra attachment. While the PlayStation 2 didn't have as many peripherals as some of the other consoles this generation, it did have the iToy. You could also play PlayStation 1 games on it and even use PlayStation 1 controllers, though the very similar DualShock 2 controller will work fine enough. In fact, I think that the PlayStation systems have one of the best controller designs out there. Though, back on the topic of backwards compatibility, if you want to save your data for your PlayStation 1 games on the PlayStation 2, you can't use a PlayStation 2 memory card. You do need an individual PlayStation 1 memory card in order to perform such a task, and thankfully I do own one. In fact, the backwards compatibility in general is great. Even PlayStation 1 games that won't work on the PlayStation 3, like Ball Blazer Champions and Star Wars Rebel Assault 2, work perfectly on the PS2. This came in handy for me because after getting the PlayStation 2 like a year ago, I was running out of money, so I ended up having to sell my PlayStation 1. While I hate letting go of a console, and the PlayStation 1 is actually my favorite 5th gen console, the backwards compatibility ensured that I could still play everything I owned for the thing. Whereas if I sold my N64, that would not be the case at all.
Come on, Rogue Squadron, fit. Play. Play.
Why are you looking at me like that?
The GameCube has a box-like design with its buttons and ports being in very easy to recognize locations. This and the handle on the back gave the system the nickname Purple Lunchbox, despite the fact that it came in other colors like platinum and black and not just indigo. The games were stored on 1.5GB mini DVDs. This was a major point of criticism, seeing how, as a result, the system could not play DVD movies. The system's design was another point of criticism because it was supposedly too kid-friendly, and thus people assumed that the console itself was solely targeted towards kids, when exclusive titles like Geist and Eternal Darkness Sandy's Requiem definitely prove otherwise. I also think that both points are pretty stupid. The supposed kid-friendly nature of the console can be very easily debunked, and as for the DVD issue, yeah, let's talk about it. When I was a little kid in elementary school, looking at these consoles for the first time, I really didn't care about DVD playback capabilities. If I wanted to watch DVDs, I'd ask for a DVD player. I cared much more about the games that each system had to offer. Really, all it was to me was an extra convenience, not a primary selling point. And to this day, now that I own all the consoles from that generation, my outlook is still largely the same, though I do watch DVDs on my PlayStation 2 fairly often. As for the games themselves, I'll get to that later. I should also mention that in Japan, there actually was a model of the GameCube that could run DVD movies, called the Panasonic Q. However, it didn't sell well and wasn't brought over to the Western markets. The GameCube has 4 controller slots, 2 memory card slots, and 3 expansion slots for attachments such as modems for broadband play. The aforementioned online capabilities were hardly utilized in favor of connecting a Game Boy Advance to the system for extra features and even some games altogether. This might have sounded gimmicky to many at the time, but for the sake of longevity, I think that this was a good decision. I mean, no matter how old the system gets, you could still play your GameCube games with full functionality. Whereas with the other systems, it could be awkward to see the option for online multiplayer, but find yourself unable to use it because the servers have been shut down. That, and I feel that developers using this feature actually implemented it in very creative ways, allowing for some very unique gameplay. There was also the Game Boy Player, which was essentially a big Game Boy Advance, thus allowing you to play any Game Boy game on the GameCube. The GameCube has higher graphical capabilities than the PlayStation 2 and Dreamcast, and games like Pikmin, Metroid Prime, and especially the Star Wars Rogue Squadron games took advantage of the extra capabilities, thus showing exactly what the system was capable of. In all honesty, the best looking games I've seen from the entire generation were on the GameCube. The first thing that I have to say about the Xbox is that it's bulky. Really bulky. Heck, the peripherals, cords, and even controllers are also needlessly bulky. The controller in particular received criticism, and thus it was revised with the S model, with the former being retroactively named Fatty. It was that big of a problem. Regardless of the controller model, one strange aspect of them is that they alone cannot plug into the system. You need a special adapter that attaches the end of the cord in order to use the controller at all. I'd understand it a bit more if it was long and it was like half of the collective wire's length, but no, it's the only thing about the system that's needlessly small. If that's the case, and seeing how it would probably cost more to make than just making a standard controller, as well as it only serving as a complication as opposed to a benefit, why make it at all? Heck, the third-party controllers, despite feeling rather cheap, don't make this mistake. You can just plug them in regularly. As a result of all of this nonsense, I have 3 controllers, but I can only use 2 of them at once, as one of my Xbox controllers came in without the adapter. Again, if the system had replaceable wires for the controllers or something, that'd make a little more sense, but this decision is clearly devoid of any logic. Speaking of bizarre design choices, pressing the eject button both turns on the console and resets the console, despite the fact that the system has its own independent power button, thus making the power button almost entirely pointless. With the other systems, you can at least put the game in before booting the console, thus allowing the game to start directly after the system's respective startup sequence. Here, the only times where the game will start regularly is if the game is already in the console. That is the only time where the power button is actually useful. Otherwise, get used to going to the BIOS menu against your will. In the BIOS menu, there is no play game option, like in every other 6th gen console. Here, regardless of what you're doing, once the game is in the console, the system will temporarily freeze and start the game, once again, against your own will. I'll admit that this isn't the worst, as you can plan around it, however it just comes across as awkward, jarring, and unpolished. One awesome thing about the console, on the other hand, is that it has a built-in hard drive in addition to memory cards, thus making memory management easier than it was on the other consoles. In fact, another thing of note about the Xbox is that its hardware architecture is closer to a PC of the time, which is fitting given the system's origins. It's also worth mentioning that the Xbox has the best graphics hardware out of the 6th gen consoles. In fact, this was the system's primary selling point. However, I should have mentioned that I evaluate graphics different than many. In my mind, good hardware or a good engine are nothing if the games really don't take advantage of it. And this is one of the Xbox's biggest problems. The graphics in the games really don't use the hardware well, in my opinion. I mean, they look fine on their own, but in comparison to some of the games on the GameCube, both on a visual level and on terms of how they make use of the hardware, they really fail a lot of the time. For example, here's a character model in Halo, and here's a character model in Rogue Leader. Here's a hallway in Halo 2, and here's one in Rebel Strike. Here's a tree in Halo 2, and here's the wildlife in Pikmin. Here's Shrek, and here's Ratchet & Clank on PlayStation 2. I don't think that I was picking unfair examples of Xbox games, seeing how all of them were ones that critics praised as examples of how the Xbox has superior hardware. There's not a single game on the system that I can point to and say, oh yeah, that's a game that uses the hardware to the fullest on every level. At best, you get games that look on par with the other consoles with intermittent bursts of untapped potential. Games like Halo 2, which is all around the best looking game I've seen on the thing, fits into this category. The character models look fantastic, but the environments range from, again, on par to rather underwhelming. At worst, which is actually a disturbingly common scenario, you get games that wouldn't look out of place on the N64. Now, before I move on to the games, I would like to address something that's always of interest to me in the gaming medium: the music. Now, this might sound like a silly subject to cover, seeing how each system could play CD quality music. However, the soundtracks that came out in this generation were so damn good that it would be a crime not to address it. Each system had at least one exclusive title with a killer soundtrack, and many of the multi-platform games also had amazing soundtracks. So instead of me talking about them, why don't I just show you some examples? Now, when covering individual games, I'm not going to go into as much detail as I normally do, not by a long shot. I'm really just doing this to give you an idea of what each game, and by extension each respective library, is like. Even though the Dreamcast had a significantly shorter lifespan, there were tons of great games released for the system. Dreamcast games are generally harder to come by than some of the others like the PlayStation 2, so I don't have as many games for it as I would like. However, I really like the games that I own for it, and I do feel the incentive to get more when looking at the system's library. Sonic Adventure is awesome. It is rough around the edges and it does kind of show its age. However, I never felt that this was to the point where it got in the way of my overall enjoyment of the game, and the game itself remains very entertaining. It's a 3D platformer that allows you to play as multiple characters, each with their own gameplay style. Most of them are awesome, but Big the Cat's gameplay is downright horrendous. Predictably enough, Sonic's gameplay is the main attraction, at least for me. Running across wide open environments with lots of platforming is always appealing to me, and the game itself is very spectacle-based. In fact, subsequent spectacle-based platformers like Pac-Man World 2 probably took some inspiration from this one. From running away from a bunch of killer whales to snowboarding away from an avalanche and ice cap, this game is just packed with crazy scenarios. However, the spectacle never really gets in the way of the platforming and exploration. It's a solid platformer overall with some excellent things about it. Sonic Adventure 2, on the other hand, is far more refined, and as a whole it is the better game in my opinion. Some people prefer the more wide-open nature of the first game, and I definitely understand why. Here the gameplay is broken up a bit, with Sonic and Shadow having the speed and spectacle, Tails and Eggman having the platforming, and Knuckles and Rouge having the exploration. However, to the game's credit, they do intertwine. For example, there is still platforming and exploration in the speed stages, and so on. As a result, the game still feels focused, and thanks to less bugs, feels more refined. It also helps that this is one of those games that throws you from one crazy scenario to the next, and it's just a blast to play as a result. The story is surprisingly dark, but very well done. Overall, it's an awesomely hectic adventure that I would definitely recommend to fans of the platforming genre. Crazy Taxi is a game that just reeks of the late 90s, and seeing how I was a little kid back then, I can't help but adore it. It's an arcade-style driving game where you pick up people and bring them to their destination before the time limit runs out. The game rewards you for causing as much mayhem as possible along the way, and man is it satisfying to do so. There's also a lot of product placement, but only for things that were considered radical at the time. The game may be stupid and mindless, but it's awesomely stupid and mindless, and if you're into those kinds of games, I highly recommend this. Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit with this next one, seeing how it was released on the N64 and PlayStation 1, but it's not on any of the other 6th generation consoles, and I do feel it's worth mentioning. Toy Story 2 Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue was always one of my favorite 5th gen platformers, so I was very happy to see it on the Dreamcast. As you'd expect, it's a 3D platformer with large environments made out of what we recognize as small things. The game design really takes advantage of the fact that you're a small toy, and comes across as really inventive a lot of the time. The music is surprisingly good, with Al's Penthouse being one of my favorite songs in all of gaming. The only problem that I have with this version is that the analog controls are a bit wonky, presenting you with the inability to walk straight forward using the analog stick. Thankfully, this isn't a problem if you just use the D-pad, which is comfortable to use, so it doesn't come across as too big an inconvenience. This isn't a problem with the other versions I've played, but nonetheless, I do consider it to be a good game regardless of what system you play it on, and I wanted to cover it briefly here. Other notable games for the system include Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, Phantasy Star, Skies of Arcadia, Soul Calibur, and if you like weird games, then Seaman. PlayStation 2 has a huge library of games, and this is both a great thing and kind of a bad thing. On one hand, there were tons of great games released for it. On the other hand, there are also tons of bad games released for it. In its later years, many of the games being released for the PS2 were the same games that plagued the Wii. You know how the Wii was known for having some of the worst third-party games imaginable? Well, games like Ninja Breadman and Winter Sports The Ultimate Challenge are also on the PlayStation 2. Now, not all of this is bad. For instance, I'm one of the few people who actually enjoys Crash of the Titans. However, the point remains that the PS2 wasn't exactly known for quality control. However, this doesn't distract from the fact that the good games on the PS2 are really, really good. Jak and Daxter, as I've said before, has quickly become one of my all-time favorite games, and the sequels, while not quite as good in my opinion, are still great games that are definitely worth looking into. However, let's focus on the first game. The game is an open-world collectathon platformer. All of the environments are connected with very logical progression, giving you the sense that you're just exploring one big cohesive world. It also helps that the environments themselves are very distinct and have a lot of things to interact with. Throughout the game's duration, I just felt this great sense of freedom, which is what an exploration-based game should accomplish. So with that said, if you're into games like Super Mario 64 or just love games with an emphasis on exploration like I do, I can't recommend this game enough. Play it if you haven't already. Sly Cooper is a stealth-based 3D platformer that really plays with the concept. Now, I haven't played the sequels very extensively, so I can't say much about those, but I can conclude that this is a very well done game. It's a very solid 3D platformer that feels very unique amongst the crowd. Many people criticize platformers of the era for being all the same and very generic. If this game is any indication, that's bullshit. Ratchet & Clank is a combat-based platformer with tons of crazy weapons and abilities.
That is the Morph Array, and that, of course, is Jerry. The Morph Array is used in Ratchet & Clank to turn your enemies into chickens.
Wait, before you do that, just explain to me how it's gonna work.
Oh, it worked! Jerry's a chicken! Are you sure we can turn him back, Jerry?
The Morph Array, one of 36 weapons and gadgets not fit for this world.
Thankfully, it's not just the gameplay mechanics alone doing all the work. The level design actually does make good use of everything you obtain. The game is very much a case of what you see is what you get, though. You're not going to find an artistic masterpiece here, at least not in my mind. However, it still remains to be a very entertaining and engaging platform game. Before I move on, I should establish that there are a ton of RPGs on the system, and if you're into games of the genre, then the PS2 will probably please you more than the others. I'm honestly not a big fan of RPGs, and as a result, I'm not exactly in the position to fairly evaluate individual games belonging to such a genre, so that's why I'm not covering games like Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy, or Persona. Now, the GameCube didn't have the same kind of third-party support that the PS2 did, and many multi-platform games were released for the Xbox and PS2, but did not have a GameCube release, probably because of the mini-DVD format with lower storage capacity. A few games remedied this by taking up multiple discs, but this wasn't as common. As a result of this, the GameCube relied primarily on its exclusive library, and while the multi-platform games were still very present, they weren't quite as prominent as they were on other consoles. Thankfully, the GameCube's exclusive library is absolutely fantastic. I have never seen a game console with an exclusive library this consistently good. Granted, there are a couple of duds, and I do literally mean a couple, but even the duds aren't the worst. Universal Studios' Theme Park Adventure and the Magical Mirror starring Mickey Mouse, while bad, don't reach the levels of, say, Hong Kong 97 for the Super Famicom. Now, I'm not including games like Aquaman and Shrek Extra Large, despite being popular choices, because they're not GameCube exclusives. Both games were also on the Xbox, with the latter being a port of an Xbox game, which doesn't surprise me the slightest, but we'll get to that later. So with that said, what are the good games? Well, right off the top of my head, out of the games I've played, we got Animal Crossing, Billy Hatcher, Chibi Robo, Eternal Darkness, F-Zero GX, Geist, Kirby Air Ride, Luigi's Mansion, Mario Kart, Mario Party, Metroid Prime, Pac-Man vs. Paper Mario, Pikmin, Star Fox Assault, Star Wars Rogue Leader, Star Wars Rebel Strike, Super Smash Bros. Melee, Super Mario Sunshine, Super Monkey Ball, Beautiful Joe, Wario World, and The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these, as that would take way too much time. And I do want to get to the Xbox and multi-platform games too, but the fact that there are so many games of consistently high quality is really impressive to me. As far as the Nintendo games on the system go, I think that this is their best lineup since the Super Nintendo. Yes, that good. Upon revisiting these games, it becomes very apparent that they were more focused on making fun and interesting games, instead of just trying to pander to the overzealous nostalgic fanboys. They took far more risks and experimented more here, resulting in some of the best games that they have ever made, at least in my opinion. However, it's not just Nintendo making good game after good game. Companies like Sega, Capcom, Namco, and Factor 5 really added to the library with their games. Now, I'm mostly going to talk about the ones that aren't brought up as much. We've all heard how great Super Smash Bros. Melee, Metroid Prime, and Mario Sunshine are, and I do believe that they deserve that recognition. However, here are some games for the system that I think should be looked at a little more. Billy Hatcher and the Giant Egg is an awesomely bizarre platformer. He plays a little boy in a chicken suit who rolls eggs around. Rolling eggs over fruit and vegetables will cause the egg to grow, and the bigger the egg is, the more powerful it is when used as an attack. Some eggs have animals inside them that help you traverse the stages, and once certain eggs have reached their full size, you can hatch them, and thus the aforementioned animals will come out. Despite its cartoony exterior, the game actually gets pretty challenging as it progresses. Overall, it's just one of those platformers that has a very distinct identity and lives in a world of its own. If you're into unique platformers, I definitely give this one a go. Geist is a first-person action-adventure game where you play as a ghost who can possess people, animals, and objects. It's a pretty inventive setup, and the game really delivers on it. Despite the game being M-rated and featuring supernatural elements, it's not particularly that scary, nor does it really try to be. It's more focused on having the player interact with their surroundings in interesting and unique ways, and it's good at it. Now, I did get confused every now and then, but once I analyzed my surroundings further, I got through just fine. One of my favorite things about the game is the music. It really makes you feel like you're working your way towards a goal, and comes across as quite motivational. The game itself might be a little clunky and the graphics could have been better, but it's overall a very interesting game, and I'd look into playing it if given the opportunity. Okay, it would be a crime for me not to bring up these two. Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader, and Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike. I'm covering them both, seeing how they're essentially two halves of one bigger game, and individually they're some of the most impressive games on the system. Rogue Leader is brought up quite a bit as one of the best games the GameCube has to offer, while Rebel Strike is a bit more underrated in my opinion. Let's start with Rogue Leader. This was a GameCube launch title and easily one of the best. Essentially, the game takes all of the major flight scenes in the Star Wars trilogy and translates them into the gaming medium flawlessly. Now, many of these scenes in question have had several other video game adaptations. However, their incarnations in Rogue Leader are without a doubt the best. I'm going to use the Death Star attack as an example of this. One thing that the Rogue Squadron games were exceptionally good at was immersing the player. Imagine feeling like you were going down the Death Star trench yourself. That's what you feel here. Darth Vader is chasing you down. Obi-Wan is telling you to use the Force, and the scene plays out exactly like the film, but with full interactivity throughout its duration. Most other Death Star stages use a cutscene during the more climactic parts, but here, you're living those moments.
Use the Force, Luke.
His computer's off. Luke, you switched off your targeting computer. What's wrong?
Nothing, I'm all right. Yahoo! You're all clear, kid. Now let's blow this thing and go home.
If you're a big Star Wars fan, this is one of the most euphoric moments that you'll ever play in a video game. Okay, now imagine an entire game like that! Many people prefer this over the original Rogue Squadron due to its fast pace and sheer love for the source material. However, I honestly get far more immersed when playing the original Rogue Squadron than I do when playing this. Not that this game isn't immersive, it is. I just feel that it isn't to the same extent. I also don't feel that this game is quite as strategy heavy or as wide open as the original, as it focuses much more on the action. Granted, it's really good at the action, and those elements are still present, I just feel that the original is more effective. Rebel Strike, on the other hand, finds more of a balance. While still more fast-paced than the original, there's still more of an emphasis on atmosphere than there was in Rogue Leader, and I feel that helps aid the immersion. The atmosphere itself is actually pretty dark and unwelcoming. There are times where you get this really intense vibe from it, often reflecting the objectives themselves. Some of the craziest things in the entire series happen in this game, and I love it for that. If you couldn't tell, while Rogue Leader focused more on the events that took place in the movies, Rebel Strike focuses more on stuff that happens in between, allowing for some really awesome scenarios like attacking a Super Star Destroyer under construction at an enemy shipyard, being trapped in an enclosed space with swarms of lethal prototype TIE fighters, and controlling an AT-AT. Also, one mission has you uncovering Obi-Wan's Jedi Starfire from Star Wars Episode 2, and it comes equipped with seismic charges.
We've got some sort of sonic charge. That escort carrier's shields are down. We need help against these Imperials. One escort carrier down.
The game also has several versus and multiplayer modes, as well as co-op throughout the entirety of Rogue Leader's campaign. That's right, 2 games in 1. Actually, there are even more than that, seeing how you can unlock the old Atari Star Wars arcade games. There's also a music hall, a documentary, and audio commentary in the actual stages themselves. Even the standard single player has 2 campaigns and plenty of bonus missions, so not only is this one of the GameCube's most impressive games on a graphical level, but on a storage level as well. They crammed so much into this game, it's unbelievable. So with that said, you're probably wondering why the game gets flack in the first place. Well, people don't like the ground missions. However, I can't speak for them, seeing how I actually really like the ground stages. They're programmed and designed competently. After all, this is Factor 5, it's kind of their thing. You get to do fun and creative things in them, and this allows for some more scenes from the movies to be recreated. The only problem I have with them is that while action and exploration are often present, I would have liked to have seen more strategy, seeing how strategy is a strong factor as to what makes the series so great, and was also very present in the fight missions in this game. So while I feel this is more focused than some of the other games I've played, it's not as focused as some of the other Rogue Squadron games. On that note, if you want a more focused game, play Rogue Leader. If you want a game that has a little more substance, play Rebel Strike. Personally, I prefer Rebel Strike. Finally, we have the Xbox. Upon retrospect, the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and GameCube all have fairly expansive libraries with lots of awesome games being released for each system. The Xbox has Halo, which is awesome. Easily one of the best games of the entire generation. Sadly though, there's not much else beyond that. Outside of Halo, the Xbox's library is really mediocre in my opinion. For starters, there are a ton of bad exclusives for this thing, with only a handful of good ones. And almost all of the good ones have been ported over to the PC, or can be played on the Xbox 360, which even with my limited exposure, I can safely say has a better library than this. So unless you really want to play games like Shrek, there really isn't any real reason to get the original Xbox. To be fair, the main selling point of the Xbox was its superior graphics, but as I've said before, they really don't deliver. So the only satisfaction one would get on that level is by playing the multi-platform games with marginally better graphics. However, almost all of those games were designed with the PlayStation 2 in mind, and they only improved the graphics so much when porting the game over, if they improved the graphics at all. So even that only goes so far. I understand that I'm being pretty hard on the Xbox, so to lighten the mood for a while, here's the highlights of the Xbox. Halo is amazing. It's a first-person shooter with very strategic combat and a heavy emphasis on exploration, atmosphere, and storytelling. It's very well paced and exceptionally well done. It's more quiet and subdued than many of the games of the genre, but that holds my interest even more. It also has some great multiplayer. Halo 2 is also great. It furthers the story and expands upon the fictional universe that the first game created, on both a narrative level and a gameplay level by giving you more things to interact with. However, for whatever reason, I'm just not as interested in this one. It's still very good, but I greatly prefer the atmosphere and gameplay of the original. Regardless, it's more Halo goodness. Star Wars Republic Commando is another first-person shooter that puts you in charge of an elite group of clone troopers called Commandos. The premise is very well handled, with each commando having a unique skill that comes into play throughout the game's duration. Each commando also has a unique personality, and just listening to what each one has to say can be very entertaining. The game is also quite challenging, and the music is unbelievable. Some of the most epic quiet music that I've ever heard in a game. Some of the other notable games for the system include Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay, and the most perverse game that I've ever seen. There's also a port of Conker's Bad Fur Day on the N64, and while the graphics are significantly better, I'd rather play on the N64 seeing how that system has more to offer. Yeah, despite the fact that the Nintendo 64 didn't have a whole lot beyond the titles that everyone talks about, at least it had a good number of games that people talked about. The Xbox doesn't really even have that. So before I wrap up, here are some of the great multi-platform games that you can play regardless of which console you own or intend to get. SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom is a 3D platformer in the style of Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, with very strategic enemy placement, great level design, and one hell of a final boss. This is one I've covered before, and yes, I do intend on covering the SpongeBob movie game sometime in the future. Pac-Man World 2 is a game that I've talked non-stop about on this channel, and I've stated that this is the best 3D platformer that I've ever played. It's very clear that the programmers and level designers had a very good understanding of what makes the genre work in the first place, as they took those components to new heights and, in my opinion, set a new standard of what platform games can achieve. I've never played a game where the act of jumping from one platform to another instilled this much emotion in me. This was also the case with every other interaction that I made with the environments present. I really felt like I was interacting with a tangible environment as opposed to just a hollow mesh of polygons. That, and as I've said many times before, the music is some of the best I've ever heard. I've played every version of this game, and I consider the GameCube version to be the best, seeing how it has the fewest glitches, the best camera, and the overall best performance out of the different versions. Rayman 3 is one of my personal favorite Rayman games. Many people complain about the beat-em-up combat, and normally I'd side with them as I'm not the biggest fan of that kind of gameplay, but I'm sorry, I just love these environments. I love all the different things that happen in the stages, and some of the music is incredible. It might not have the gloomy mood and atmosphere that Rayman 2 has, which is another great game by the way, but what it has is very entertaining. The Haunted Mansion is a puzzle adventure game, and in my opinion, this is how you make a game that fits under that classification. In each puzzle, I never had a problem finding out what the variables were. The thought process came from how I was using the variables at hand. That's how you handle thought-based gameplay of any kind. And I think that's something that certain games ignore when attempting to pull this sort of thing off. That, and even if you know exactly what you need to do, the puzzles are so inventive that it's a lot of fun regardless. I did a whole review on this in the past, and I still stand by the conclusion that this is a really good game. Shadow the Hedgehog is a game that I've heard people both love and detest. Personally, I love it. The people who are against it usually complain about its tone and the use of weapons because they think that it's not fitting for a Sonic game. Well, yeah, there is merit to that argument. However, in my opinion, this isn't a main Sonic game, it's a Sonic spin-off. Furthermore, I think that the weapon system is very well implemented, and I found it to be very engaging. Otherwise, the game plays out quite similarly to Sonic Adventure 2. In fact, it makes use of concepts that are originally going to be in that game but were scrapped, such as the use of non-linear stage progression and multiple endings. I actually really like the stages as well. Sky Troops, Mad Matrix, and Lava Shelter in particular, I find myself playing a lot. Overall, I really like it. I think it's pretty underrated. Yeah, the mild cursing is hilariously forced, but the actual gameplay remains to be quite solid. Of course, what system is your favorite is entirely up to you. However, I might as well sum up my own thoughts to help conclude the video. In my opinion, the two best consoles of the 6th generation were the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. The GameCube due to its fantastic exclusive library, and the PlayStation 2 due to the exclusive library in addition to some of the multi-platform games that the GameCube didn't get. As far as the Dreamcast goes, I would suggest playing some of the ports on other consoles just to see how much you like them, and decide from there if you want to get the system after that point. Personally, I think it's a great console and I'm glad I got it. As for the Xbox, I'm glad that I have it, but I think it's easily the worst console out of the bunch. And while it's better than some of the other consoles out there, I do consider it to be the worst console that I own in general, so I can't honestly recommend it like I can with the others. However, this is all opinion-based, and if you disagree, there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe the Xbox is your favorite console, and if it is, I'm not going to question that. So as a whole, what do I think of this generation? Well, I love it thoroughly. If I didn't, I wouldn't be making this video. I can't say that I'll make more of these, but I had a lot of fun doing this, and I hope that you got some enjoyment out of it as well. With that said, as always, thanks for watching.
You may not think I'm attractive.
Yes.
Grrr.